Joining me today is a Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, as well as a New York Times best-selling author whose new book, Enlightenment Now, is for sale right now. Stephen Paker, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thank you.
I am thrilled to have you here. I think I have emailed or called or contacted or pigeon messaged everyone related to you or that knows you in any way to get you here.
And here I am.
And here you are.
It worked.
It goes to prove that a little positivity, I think, can make some things happen.
So true.
Yeah. All right. A lot I want to talk to you about. I thought before we dive into the book and all the things that you teach and write about and all that, I like hearing a little bit about people's history and where they come from and growing up and all that. You are Canadian, and I've had a lot of Canadians on lately. I find there's something about Canadians in general that I like. What is it about Canadians that leads to a certain pleasant disposition?
Well, we're so reasonable. We're so polite. Sometimes people say the motto of Canada is peace, order, and good government. Yeah. It's a country that has been diverse for quite some time. Quebec, where I grew up, has an English-speaking community and a French-speaking community. And we didn't begin with a revolution, unlike the United States, but we negotiated our way to independence. We were part of the British Empire, then the British Commonwealth, and kind of have that British reserve and politeness.
Yeah.
So that we have some things going for us.
A couple of things going for it. Yeah, at least all the Americans end up moving up there. Right. If things keep going this way, although
we might build a wall.
Yeah, right. You guys may end up building the wall. Exactly. Tell me a little bit about growing up, your family. What kind of family you grew up in?
I grew up in the English-speaking section of Montreal. In Montreal, it was pretty segregated when I grew up. I grew up in the Jewish English-speaking community, which was known for producing, among others, Leonard Cohen, who was a contemporary of my mother's, the author Mordecai Richler, who was a contemporary of my father's, William Shatner, Burt Bacharach.
Wow.
Saul Bellow spent his childhood in Montreal. So it's a small community that has a number of people that we're proud of.
Yeah. What do you make of that? That so many. I mean, that's a pretty diverse, interesting group of people right there, and I'm sure there are others.
It may just be that having many cultural influences, both Canada is really dominated by the United States. It really is the 800-pound gorilla next door.
Yeah.
So there's the American influence, the British influence, the French influence. Perhaps it's just being in a cosmopolitan, diverse community that helped with that, and of course the Jewish influence. Although it was not, I didn't grow up, and none of the people that I mentioned grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community. I grew up with a Reform temple. We didn't take God all that seriously, but we did take Jewish identity seriously.
Yeah.
I don't remember a moment in which I decided, I'm an atheist. It just was not a big issue one way or another.
Do you find that to be sort of standard thing with most secular Jews? I think that's sort of, at least the ones that I've been talking to on this show that I think are sort of out there more, that seems to be a thing, that there's an ethnic identity or a cultural identity that's separate from the belief part.
Absolutely, and I think that's more true of Judaism than it is of, say, Catholicism, where the belief really is stipulated. In Judaism, there's a bit of a kind of don't ask, don't tell, as long as you obey the laws and rituals.
Right.
If you keep the Sabbath, if you have matzah on Passover, then you're a good Jew, and what you believe is just not as important. One rabbi said to my wife Rebecca Goldstein, another secular Jew, well-known a secular humanist writer, when she talked about her novel, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction, which is kind of the great atheist novel. And she spoke at a Jewish community center, and I was a little worried whether there'd be some pushback from the rabbi who introduced her. And afterwards he went over and he said, there's nothing in Judaism that says you have to believe in God. You just can't believe in more than one of them.
That's pretty perfect. Do you think there's an inherent problem there, sort of disconnecting God from religion, even if it really is, just for the longevity of it, let's say?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. I think that may have been part of the explanation for why, there's so many secular Jewish intellectuals kind of immersed in argument, disputation, particularly about morals and ethics, but without but it was all argument, disputation. It wasn't a catechism that you had to recite. It wasn't a set of beliefs that you have to have. So there was a tradition of disputation. That's what the rabbis were famous for,
Right.
the pill pull, the hair splitting, and maybe that was a contributor as well. But I went to public schools. And in fact, when you go to public schools in Quebec, in my childhood, it meant you went to Protestant schools because it was divided along religious lines. There were Protestant schools and Catholic schools.
Oh, interesting.
Protestant meant un-Catholic, basically, everyone else,
Yeah.
including the Muslims and the Jews and the Chinese and so on. It was a bizarre system.
Yeah,
It was
how interesting.
patently unconstitutional in this country. And I actually got a pretty serious Protestant religious education. I sang hymns. We said the Lord's Prayer every day. I learned about the life of Jesus.
So they had the Jews and the Muslims and everyone
All
else
of them in the
getting a Protestant
schools. Yeah. And at one point, I remember I think I was 8 or 9, and we didn't even belong to a temple. And I said to my mother, one of my friends said that Jews aren't supposed to believe in Jesus. Should I not believe in Jesus anymore? And she sent me to Hebrew school so fast it made my head spin.
That's hilarious.
And then my teachers, because they couldn't hire Catholic teachers either, and virtually everyone in Quebec is among the Francophone community are Catholics. So they actually hired Algerian and Tunisian and Moroccan Jews to teach French to the Jewish and Protestant kids of Montreal. The Protestant kids of Montreal did not learn French from native Quebecois. We learned it from Egyptian and Tunisian immigrants. So that's how bizarre it was.
I'm pretty sure I know the subject of your next book. I mean, it sounds like there's just so much richness just in that, or at least there's a little comedy in there or something. It sounds like your family was kind of on the intellectual side, or at least that the community was in general.
Well-read house was full of books and magazines. My father had a law degree but didn't practice when I was a child. He was had some little bit of real estate, did sales before starting a law practice pretty late in life. My mother was, like most mothers of the 50s and 60s, a homemaker, but then found a career when she was kind of getting bored. Became a guidance counselor and then a vice principal of a high school. And my mother, Rosalind Pinker, very intellectual, an intense reader, knows everything, intellectually very engaged.
Yeah.
And my sister, Susan, is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Has written a couple of books, one on sex differences, one on face-to-face contact. My brother, Rob, has worked for the Canadian government for several decades as a policy analyst and an administrator.
So how much of the intellectual pursuits that you all have do you think is biological versus just learned experience?
Yeah, well,
this is one of the themes that keeps coming up around these conversations.
And it was a topic of my book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature.
Yeah.
The blank slate being the metaphor that I argued became dominant in intellectual life, largely for political reasons.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit for the people that don't know the book?
Yeah, so the Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, just was re-released in 2016 with an afterword, was about the idea that there is no such thing as human nature, that we are blank slates, written on by our parents, by the culture, by education, and that there's no innate human traits or ways of learning and thinking. It's you can program a human however you want. And I argue that it was popular in the 20th century for political reasons, one of them being that it seems like the ultimate way to achieve equality. You know, if we're all zero, then 0 equals 0 equals 0, and so we all have to be equal.
Right.
I argue this is a mistake in the book, that equality is really a legal and moral principle to treat everyone equally. It's not really the belief that we're all clones or we're all blank slates. And a lot of the book tried to both lay out the science of human nature, but also to explore the political and emotional and moral baggage and coloring, and to try to clarify it. And so the difference between equality of treatment and equality of our biological endowment was a major theme. That also, of course, enters into discussion of sex differences, where one of the reasons that certain intellectual factions, certain parts of feminism want to deny that there are any sex differences. So they think, well, that will make it impossible to discriminate because there's nothing to discriminate among. We're all born exactly the same.
Right.
And I argue that's big mistake. First of all, there is a lot of evidence that men and women aren't identical in all traits.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I think there is a lot of evidence on that.
I think anyone who's had a son and a daughter, anyone who's been in a heterosexual relationship, anyone who's listened to gossip about anyone talking about anyone else, knows, men and women are really not exactly the same. But I think the myth that they're the same was introduced for political purposes. Namely, that would make discrimination irrational. Right. Because there's nothing to discriminate on. And I argue that that's just a error in logic. I strongly believe in gender equity, that no one should be prejudged because they're a man or a woman, partly because of a scientific fact that there's huge overlap between the sexes in any trait you want to look at. So you can't predict an individual's traits just knowing that they're a man or a woman. But the policy, we should be fair, doesn't require the false belief that we're the same, that we're indistinguishable.
What's the best, have you heard any argument for that belief that you thought made any sense? Or you just...
For which belief?
For the idea that these genders are equal. Like because you must hear this from other academics, right? I mean, we know that some of this stuff is being taught at schools.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that there's enormous overlap. There's no doubt, and some of the differences between the sexes are pretty small and subtle. So in, say, mathematical ability, which was one of the most controversial claims about sex differences, it led to a huge firestorm when Larry Summers, the president of Harvard, mentioned that differences between the sexes might explain why the number of engineering professors at Harvard and MIT wasn't 50-50 down the line, male-female.
Yeah, this is very much like the James Damore situation with Google.
It is exactly. I mean, it's almost a replay of it. And it isn't easy. In fact, it would be hard to say that men or women are better at math in general. You have to even drill down to certain subcomponents, like mentally rotating three-dimensional objects that men are clearly better at, but women are better at word problems in arithmetic and math. So so some of the pushback is that in fact the science is often complicated. You can't make a sweeping across-the-board generalization.
Yeah.
And then the other kind of pushback for people who defend the blank slate is, well, yeah, that's true of 2002 when your book came out, but society is changing, and more women are consuming porn, and more women are having multiple sexual partners, and maybe the differences, say, in sexuality aren't due to human nature, but just due to our culture at a particular moment that may become obsolete.
That seems incredibly dangerous to me, to view it that way.
Well, maybe. Although, you could, in some ways, it's actually highly progressive and even correct, because you could have said, 70 years ago, women don't want to go into the professions. They want to stay home with the kids and housework, and that's what makes them complete and satisfied and happy, and they'll be all neurotic and anxious if they start to become lawyers and doctors. And we know from the course of history that that's not true. That as soon as the doors opened, women did pour through the doors. And so that would be an example where too strong a claim of biological differences would have been refuted by the facts of history. So it's not a slam dunk. I mean, it is something that has to be examined on a case-by-case basis.
Are you shocked at how difficult it is to talk about all of this without getting yourself or any of the people that talk about it into hot water?
Yeah.
Because the amount of nuance that you have to go through here, as I can see you're quite well versed at, you're probably the best at it, it's a lot to make sure that somebody can't pinpoint that one line that then they're going to just drag you for.
Exactly right. Well, and the reason that I wrote The Blank Slate was, it wasn't so much, so I have a chapter on gender, but the point wasn't just to review the literature on gender differences. It was also to say, okay, so how does it matter for our public debates? And I also documented in the book how, even when the book first came out, there was a history of people being deplatformed and shouted down and called all kinds of nasty names for the view that we're not blank slates. And I said, well, look, this is based on emotion, based on bad politics, not based on the facts. So I kind of, I don't know if I want to say defended myself, but I laid out all of these political controversies. So I wasn't blundering into it naive. That was actually the subject of the book.
Right. Sometimes, though, that can't fully defend you, though,
No,
right?
it can't. And in fact, both Larry Summers and Jamie Damore,
Yeah.
they almost could have taken their speeches, and in the case of Larry Summers, partly did, from the chapter on gender in the book. So I managed to escape some trouble that people who then repeated the arguments got into trouble for.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You sort of laid out a case beforehand to defend yourself. You did like sort of a preemptive strike.
Exactly.
Where both of those guys, I know James personally, and he's been in here, where it's like he sort of stumbled into this thing, and then the reaction, the way it sort of, it just becomes this bigger beast that you end up fighting when you were just really trying to talk about science.
Well, the science, I wasn't just talking about the science, because I was talking about first the science, then what are the political and moral implications, which I thought got confused, feeding back on people trying to shoehorn the science into a politically correct position because they were kind of lazy when it came to the politics. You know, I don't believe in, obviously I don't believe in discrimination against anyone. But the point being that having that belief doesn't mean that you have to insist that we're blank slates.
Right.
And I made that argument for other controversies around human nature, like do we have any violent impulses? Where there's a kind of political argument for a different reason. Namely, people think, well, if we're innately violent, then we're kind of doomed to war forever, and if you try to reduce war, you're just some romantic peacenik and it's hopeless, and war is in human nature. Therefore, since war is bad, and if we're violent, then we'll always have war, we can't be violent. And I argue that too is illogical. We do have violent impulses. I think that's pretty clear. But it's not all we have. We also have the faculty of self-control. We also have empathy. We have cognitive processes of problem solving, so we can figure out how we can reduce war. We've got moral norms. They're just certain things you don't do. And the fact that part of us is violent doesn't mean we're doomed to violence, because part of us pushes back on the violence. I cite a statistic that 3/4 of men and 60% of women at least once have had a homicidal fantasy. They've imagined killing someone they don't like.
3/4 of men and 60% of women.
Yeah, have confessed. Yeah, and when I introduce this fact in lecture and I say, well, what does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that 3/4 of men are liars. But I point out this doesn't mean that trying to increase peace is futile, because there are other parts of human nature we can work with. And of course, that was what led to my more recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that said not only is it possible, it's happened.
Yeah.
But again, it's kind of the nexus between the political on the one hand and the scientific on the other that I was exploring. And I talked about how the people who thought they were advocates of peace tried to squash all evidence that people have violent impulses because it was just politically too uncomfortable. And I said, that's, first of all, distorting the science is never a good idea. And if you're clear about the politics, then the science doesn't even mean that we've got to accept war.
Yeah, so for someone that sort of insulated themselves from some of this, because you were doing the work beforehand, which is actually a pretty brilliant tactic, are you afraid that the hard sciences are going to be hit by all of this identity politics stuff in a bigger way than we're seeing right now when it comes to gender or race or any of these issues?
It's not even so much the hard sciences, but the social sciences.
Well, we know the social sciences
have been hit.
Yeah, but you don't fear that it's going to come for the hard sciences too?
Well, there may be some aspects of genetics and brain science that are feeling the political pressure. The neuroscience of sex differences, for example. Certainly the genetics of intelligence and personality have felt that political pressure.
Yeah.
One of my collaborators and former students, James Lee, presented a paper where he was part of a consortium that for the first time identified a number of genes that were linked to intelligence. I mean, there's no IQ gene, but there are hundreds, maybe probably thousands of genes that could bump your IQ up by a fraction of a point up or down. And they made some of the first really hard replicable discoveries, because there were a lot of bogus discoveries in the past, but theirs was really solid. And there was pretty big pushback, including from the president of the society, saying this is fascist and this is unacceptable. So there was some pushback, and this was genetics.
Yeah. So what do you make of the people that focus on like race and IQ? I've had Stefan Molyneux here. I don't know if you know who he is, but he really focuses on that. And what I wanted to know from him really was not necessarily not what do you think of this, but why the focus on that?
Yeah.
That seemed, to me, that's the part I'm more concerned about.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and it's one that torments me. I mean, on the one hand, you could make the argument, well, we should not be afraid of the truth, and for that matter, a vigorous exploration of the genetics of racial differences might show that there are no genetic differences relevant to personality or intelligence, and that would give racism a really decisive blow.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you never know that before you look.
Right.
So you can't count on that. Of course, if you do science, you've got to be prepared for any possibility. And there is, I think, a legitimate question of whether we really should be getting to the bottom of this. It's an argument that actually goes back to my old MIT colleague, Noam Chomsky, way back in the 1970s. Said, we can't insist that the truth be one way or another, because that's just contrary to the whole spirit of science. But we don't have to ask every question. There are a lot of questions that are scientifically pretty minor. They could have socially damaging consequences. So let's put them really low on the list. And he suggested that race and IQ, for example, should not be of interest in a society that treats people as individuals, because then it's just like a correlation between any two traits. And that we should it just be a low priority and something we should ignore. Now that's a little bit, I think it ignores the fact that there are people who already are dividing humans by race and measuring the outcomes and attributing it to poverty or racism, and then you kind of say, well, gee, as long as we're raising the question at all, shouldn't we look at all the hypotheses? It might even be an argument for just downplaying race in general. Instead of dividing us up by race and obsessively measuring the differences, look at things like class and income, because that's really what matters more. And just not make everything a racial issue in the first place, so that whether the racial issue is from biology kind of fades in importance.
Yeah, you mentioned the nexus of politics and science. I really like that phrase, because I think of so many of the conversations I'm having here, it seems to me that politics and science are really just linked all the time. It explains why so many people want to talk to you and why they want to talk to the Weinstein brothers and Sam Harris and so many other people. Are you a little concerned that it's becoming so political?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that what I'm doing and what some of your other guests have been doing is to try to depoliticize some of the scientific issues, and that's certainly what I tried to do in the Blank Slate, or clarify what the political issues are.
Yeah,
and not.
But it's almost impossible these days, right?
It is becoming a little bit. The landscape is really diverse and divided. I mean, there are the identity politicians and the social justice warriors and the political correctness police who are kind of making things as political as possible. I mean, they've been around for a long time. When I was a student in the 70s, there were plenty of people who were shouting things like fascists don't have the right to speak, or chanting mobs that shut down my Harvard colleague E.O. Wilson when he published Sociobiology. So this isn't a new thing. And there are certainly constituencies that are totally open to depoliticizing the science and considering the politics on its own terms. But on the other hand, there is a fringe that appears to be more radical than ever.
Yeah, how do you decide how much weight that fringe has? That seems to be one of the themes these days. It seems to be very hard to tell. Is this just this small group that's screaming a lot, or has it truly infected not only a ton of the millennial generation and a huge swath of young people, but that also it does seem to be creeping up or creeping down, depending on which way you look at it, a ton of academics at universities and all sorts of other people that actually have power.
Well, I think the academics have been distorted for quite some time, and this is an idea that's been pushed by Jonathan Haidt, Philip Tetlock, Jose Duarte, Charlotta Stern. They had a pretty widely discussed article that the title something like "Viewpoint Diversity Will Help Social Science," where they gave a number of cases, some of which I had discussed in the Blank Slate, of how just the questions that psychologists ask, the items they put on their questionnaires, the way they frame issues, just clearly has a left-wing bias. That they argued that if there were also conservatives in more of them in psych departments, then they would have pointed out, hey, your questionnaire is flawed.
Right.
And that the actual quality of the science would improve. And to the credit of my field of psychology, their paper was published there in a journal where there were 30 commentaries. So 30 people had a chance to go after them, or teams. And there was disagreement, but it was very respectful. They weren't called any nasty names, and it was a really good debate. But the question that you asked about how is this are the totally illiberal and radical movements, the ones that just shout down speakers, sometimes physically assault them. Is that the whole millennial generation, or is that just an increasingly vocal fringe? My mind was changed just a couple of days ago when I read an article in Vox about a new study. Sam Harris had sent it to me, saying that actually support for free speech is increasing, including...
I saw the article.
You saw the article?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that I wasn't... I was kind of surprised. I wasn't totally shocked.
Yeah.
Because at least my experience at Harvard is that the students are, all the ones that I've interacted with, admittedly a biased sample, but they are perfectly supportive of debate, free speech, openness.
So it's interesting. So I mentioned right before we started that I spoke at Harvard through the Open Campus
that's right.
Initiative.
Yes, right.
And it was a wonderful group, and it was clear that they were politically diverse and all the other diversity that everyone likes, but that I don't care about that much. But afterwards, we went to a dinner, and there were about 30 or 40 kids. I was with Brett Weinstein, actually. And I asked them, like, what do you guys, are you guys okay saying what you think? And do you think it's going to hurt your grades or hurt your friendship? And virtually everyone said yes. So I'm still struggling with this because I did read,
they said
yes, that it would either hurt them or they've lost friends. I mean, mostly, I sense most of them were kind of libertarian-ish, kind of live and let live, but certainly not all of them. But virtually everyone at the table said that they either were afraid to say certain things to friends or certainly to professors. So that's why when I read the articles like that at Vox and I go to these campuses and I hear this consistently, it's just hard to grade, and that's exactly why I'm posing the question to you. Yeah, it's just hard to pin.
But this article was eye-opening. That went against the narrative that the millennial generation are a bunch of snowflakes. They're a bunch of cultural revolutionaries, the warriors. It's just that there certainly is that faction, but it may not characterize our era altogether.
Yeah. Have you thought at all about how much social media is a piece of this puzzle?
Well, I don't know, and that's nowadays. Everything is blamed on social media. So it's kind of like, what the role of El Nino in the 1990s. Whatever happened, you blame it on El Nino.
That was on MySpace.
Yeah, right. I don't know. A lot of this, I think, predated social media. I think that cable news networks had a role, Fox News in particular, because it was so politicized in a way that no previous network really had been. And there are studies showing that when a town gets Fox News, and you can do the natural experiment because some towns got it before others just because the way cable companies offered different packages for no particular reason. You could tell that the towns that got Fox News became more polarized and became and shifted to the right.
Wow,
so it really did have a causal effect. That's one case where it's not just correlational.
Yeah. So you had a strange moment about a month or two ago, about 2 months ago now, where you said something to the effect of, someone asked you a question at a panel about the alt-right, and in effect you said, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. What did you say?
Well, this was
I don't want to butcher it.
Open Campus Initiative.
Yeah. Oh, it was it?
They were the ones that sponsored the event.
Okay, there you go. So I know this is a good group of people you were sitting with.
It was, and the topic of the event was, did political correctness help elect Trump? It was held almost on the anniversary of the 2016 election. And I suggested that I thought it did, in part because when you have certain ideas that are just not discussable on campus, and you've got a savvy, interconnected community, as the original alt-right were. A lot of people associate alt-right with the torch-carrying skinheads, but what I had in mind was the term as it originally applied to internet discussion groups. And that the danger of restricting debate on campus, of making certain ideas taboo, is that when smart people do stumble upon them, then they, number one, are completely alienated from the mainstream intellectual life because they think, well, this is a truth that they can't handle. What other truths can't they handle? And they since the ideas never get expressed, the kind of pushback and contextualization and counter-arguments, the kind of thing that you want for any idea, never happens. And within this like-minded community, they sometimes jump to the most extreme conclusions.
So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts.
Yeah. So I mean, an example being gender differences. If it's taboo even to mention the possibility that men and women differ, then you stumble across some pretty good scientific evidence that they do. Then you might be like Milo Yiannopoulos saying, "Oh, we should have fewer women in medical school because they're just going to drop out and have babies." Now, I mean, that's a totally idiotic idea. Mm-hmm. But the reason that he could put forward an idiotic idea is that since the whole existence of sex difference was never discussed, no one ever said that's an idiotic idea.
Yeah.
And likewise, and there are a number of other facts that are kind of undiscussable that you can take to extreme conclusions if you're not challenged, whereas if you bring them out into the open, then you can put them into perspective.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
In many cases it is. Another example is that rates of crime differ between blacks and whites. Now, if that's a fact that's almost undiscussable, but just go to FBI.gov, look up, they break down rates of crime by age, by race, by state, and there it is. Now, if you have never even noticed that, then you can say, oh, gee, I wonder if African Americans are innately more violent than whites. Now, that's completely wrong, because we know that no two ethnic groups ever have the same crime rate, and they can shift over time. It used to be the Irish that had sky-high rates of violence compared to the non-Irish, and we know that vanished over time, and the black-white difference might as well. But that second fact, namely ethnic and racial differences are ubiquitous and they can change with time, will never even get mentioned if the mere fact that there is a difference is unmentionable in the first place. So that was my argument.
Yeah.
And I gave some other examples. Anyway, that was, then there's a doctored film clip on some alt-right sites saying, oh, see, Pinker is saying that the alt-right is correct. Whereas I was actually saying, how can we starve the alt-right?
Right.
How we're feeding them inadvertently.
Right. You were basically, I mean, just for the layman that's watching this, I mean, you were basically saying, allow for more information so that those bad ideas won't be able to flourish. I mean, that was the sort of 101 version.
That was the whole point, exactly.
Yeah.
But then it was edited to leave out that parts, and then the kind of regressive left picked up on it to also suggest that I was sympathetic to the alt-right, which is the most bizarre attribution you could imagine. And indeed, Enlightenment Now has a whole chapter on why the alt-right has gone off the rails. So unfortunately, this misconception after about a day was corrected both in the New York Times and in the Guardian in England, and they came to my defense and set things right. But it was a bizarre episode of how, as the Times put it, social media makes you stupid.
Yeah, precisely. All right, so I do want to spend our whole second half talking about the book, but very quickly, just when you dealt with that whole thing, I mean, I remember reading it, and I think there was something, in an odd way, I think the reaction between, as you said, the regressive left and the alt-right, that they were sort of teaming up on you against it. I thought that it was, in a weird way, even though I know it probably personally for you was no fun, and you probably had all sorts of people saying terrible things to you, and all of that, that I thought, if anyone has read any of Stephen's books, or even remotely knows what this guy is doing, that I think, I don't know what you consider yourself politically, you strike me as sort of just an old school liberal. I don't want to, you can counter that if you...
Centrist, moderate, I have sympathies to different policies, but yeah, I'm pretty eclectic and centrist.
Yeah, so that basically I thought, this guy is so obviously just decent and coming at this from a scientific perspective, that if this is what they're going to do, where you say one line, this is going to I mean, really, my feeling was it could destroy like the fabric of society, really, if we just start picking off everybody. And I've seen a lot of instances of this. And this, when I've talked to Damore, or I've talked to Brett Weinstein, or Lindsay Shepard from Laurier up in Canada, and a few others, but I thought yours was just such an example of this is so ridiculous.
Yes, well,
perhaps there was a nice pushback to it.
Maybe, and that was exactly the New York Times response. I mean, that's why they titled the op-ed by Jesse Singal, "How Social Media Makes Us Stupid."
Yeah.